welcome to Risky Bitness. Double Dragon 2, baby. Double Dragon is a legendary video game franchise and considered by many to be the granddaddy of all beat-em-ups. I hope you enjoyed my first video on the different versions of the first game in the series, Double Dragon. Please give it a watch if you haven't already. This time around, we'll be looking at the different versions of Double Dragon 2 and taking a look at just how ingenuitive and impressive these iterations are. Before we get started, I want to make it clear that the versions I've chosen are the most relevant to my own experience with retro games. I know there are several more versions on all sorts of platforms, but for this video, I'll be focusing on the following versions: the original arcade, the NES version, the Genesis/Megadrive version, and, as a curiosity, the PC Engine CD version. I didn't even know these games had been released on the Megadrive or PC Engine until many years after their respective platforms were retired. Did you know? Tell me about it in the comments, and also be sure to tell me, what is your favorite version of Double Dragon 2? With that introduction out of the way, let's get down to business. Double Dragon 2: The Revenge was first released to arcades in December of 1988. The storyline takes a morbid turn here, as the Shadow Warriors, now finally given a name, murder Marion in retaliation for their defeat at the hands of the Lee brothers, also now finally given a name. The brothers set out on a journey of revenge the only way they know how, by beating the crap out of every single member of the Shadow Warriors. Double Dragon 2 was not originally intended to be a sequel to Double Dragon. Instead, it was supposed to be a simple upgrade. This probably explains why it all feels so familiar. The stages are more or less the same as the original game, and in some places the similarities are impossible to ignore. Mission 2 is basically exactly the same. During development of the upgrade, the team began to add more features, including new attacks and enemies, and eventually it became a whole new game, built on entirely new hardware. You'll notice that the Lee brothers have changed costumes, this time wearing black and white respectively. It adds a nice subtle touch, but I think I like the blue and red better. The graphics are even really similar to those of the original Double Dragon, but the feel of the game has really been overhauled. It has a much more futuristic look with a lot of metallic colors. Blue and black dominate the color palette, and the backgrounds and structures look a lot more angular. This is definitely the first glimpse we ever get of the post-apocalyptic setting that would later become canon for the series. While the soundtrack here has some bangers, the arcade audio hardware just isn't that great. It kind of sounds like a wet fart on the bassy stuff, and just like buzzing and popping on the high trebly stuff. It's not very good. Just like the original Double Dragon, this game can be played by 1 or 2 players simultaneously. Unlike the original, however, Double Dragon 2 has a Renegade-style control scheme, where the buttons attack to the left and right. If you attack to the direction opposite the one you're facing, you throw a kick. If you press the attack button in the direction you are facing, you throw a punch. It's a little disorienting at first, and it really does take some getting used to. There is still a dedicated jump button though. I found that I typically didn't really use the kick. It mostly just makes sense to move around and avoid getting attacked from behind. There are not quite as many moves here as there were in the first Double Dragon, but you still have the elbow, the hurricane kick, and the grab and throw moves. Some weapons have been added, like a shovel, which is kind of nifty, and grenades. A number of new enemies appear as well, like a thug who throws knives, an enemy who attacks you with a pair of sticks, and the Terminator, apparently? Old enemies get new designs, like a Bobo with long hair and Punk Rock Linda. Pitfalls can still be utilized, and some new hazards exist here as well, like a thresher in the farm that will take down anyone in front of it, friend or foe. Overall, the game feels a lot harder than its predecessor, unfairly so in many ways. The controls feel a little bit slow, which will definitely eat up your quarters. It experiences some of the slowdown of its predecessor as well. Once you reach the end, after a surprisingly easy battle against Willy, you will face off against your own shadow in a surprise battle. If you're playing with 2 players, then 2 shadows will appear. The shadows have amazing supernatural powers and can become invisible, throw fireballs, and even teleport. The levels are really short, and you can complete the entire game in about 30 minutes. I felt like the original Double Dragon is just a much better game. This one added some new things, but the Renegade controls feel unnecessary, the sluggishness of the controls is a big problem, and it's just not a fantastic experience. Now the NES version, however, is a different story entirely. Following up on the heels of the first NES Double Dragon, Technos developed this themselves and delivered an experience that is entirely unique from that of the arcade game. It was released in January of 1990, taking place in the year 19XDX, so you know it's in the future. The NES version of Double Dragon 2 takes place after a nuclear war. The Shadow Warriors are called the Black Shadow Warriors here, and the game starts exactly the same way. They kill Marion. What's really cool about this game is that it's one of the few NES titles with multiple difficulty levels. But watch out, because on the North American release, you can't finish the game on easy or medium. You have to put the game on hard mode in order to finish all 9 levels. Easy mode ends after level 3, and medium ends after level 6. The Famicom version actually allowed players to finish the whole game on any setting. This feels a lot like how they used to try to make the US versions harder to discourage completing the game in an afternoon rental. Don't be worried though, hard mode really isn't super hard. You can still easily beat the game, especially if you use the stealing lives trick. Unlike the first Double Dragon, this game has 2-player simultaneous play. If you select 2-player game A, there's no friendly fire, you can't hurt the other player. But if you select game B, the players can fight and steal lives from each other. The trick is, when you're playing a 1-player game, select 2-player game B and kill the other player and steal all of his lives. You can even do that after you use a continue, but continues are hidden, and you have to put in a special code to use them, and the code changes depending what level you're in. By stealing the other player's lives and using the continue code, you should be able to complete the game. Again, these features are probably just there to discourage kids from completing the entire game in a weekend as a rental, or completing it quickly and returning it back to the store. This is the version of Double Dragon 2 that I grew up with, and it'll always hold a special place in my heart. I remember spending a lot of weekends with this when I was a kid, and I'm pretty sure I had the Nintendo Power issue in my desk at school for most of the year. Again, this one uses the Renegade controls. It's a lot easier to simply avoid being approached from behind. There's no back elbow, but the spin kick is really easy to do, so you can basically spam it, although enemies tend to duck under it. There's also a jumping knee that sends foes flying across the screen and is really overpowered. It's the way I beat the first boss most of the time. Obviously the graphics don't look quite as sharp as the arcade, but they're excellent for a Nintendo game. The sprites all got a significant upgrade from the first Double Dragon, and the characters feel really solid. The pixels are kind of rounded off, there's more of this illusion of depth and weight to the characters. They look a lot more impactful. The soundtrack, of course, is fantastic. There's a lot of really satisfying sound effects as well, like the pop, the pipe dropping to the floor, and the sound barrier breaking when you perform that knee strike. All the levels are completely new, and they're very much in the style of the arcade game, but with a lot more variety. There's some awkward platforming still here and there, and it can be really hard, especially in the later game. There's a whole level that is nothing but trap rooms. But the really cool thing is you can throw bad guys onto spikes and into traps. One really iconic level is the helicopter, where you can fall out of the open door if you're not careful, but you can also knock enemies into it or trick them into walking into it. There's also an underground cavern of spikes that forces you to engage with enemies on both sides, and there's this really crazy boss fight where you have to jump around on this giant tank to get to the top and fight the enemies. There's just so many really great, amazing creative ideas at play in this game. You still can't damage enemies by throwing them at each other, which kind of stinks, and you can't carry weapons from one screen to another. Some of the new weapons are here though, like a steel pipe instead of the shovel, and there's a stick of dynamite. The whip has been upgraded to a mace, or rather a flail, if you want to be technical about it. The stages are broken up by these really short story sequences in kind of a comic book style, and it makes the journey feel like a much bigger adventure. It also kind of explains how the dragons get from one location to another, unlike games at the time that tended to just sort of put you in an area and you sort of guess on how you got there. The game adds an additional boss at the end. After you defeat the Shadow, it unlocks the Shadow Master, who has even more amazing powers than the Shadow does. But the best part of this game is the mega happy ending. If you defeat the Shadow Master, Marion comes back to life. It's a miracle! This is just a fantastic game, a welcome addition to anyone's NES library, and arguably one of the best games on the system. Now, The Japan-only Megadrive version, and I'm going to say Megadrive here and not Genesis because in Japan it was called the Megadrive, and that's where this game came out, which was in December of 1991, and it's more or less a direct port of the arcade version. The conversion was handled by Palsoft and maintains most of the elements of the arcade game, only with a downgrade to the graphics. It still looks really good. The sprites are a little smaller and a little less colorful than the arcade, but I think this actually kind of looks a little bit better. The music's okay, but some of the tunes sound a little distorted, nowhere near as bad as the unlicensed Double Dragon 1 port. The Renegade-style controls work nicely with the 3-button controller, using A and C to attack and B to jump. Special moves can be a little bit awkward, some minor changes have been made to the levels. Mission 2 is much longer, you have limited continues, but it's enough to make it through the game. It controls really nicely, but there is some slowdown here and there. The boss fights felt really easy compared to the arcade game. Overall, it's a solid port that doesn't try to make the Mega Drive do anything the Mega Drive can't or doesn't want to do. It succeeds in not trying to replicate the arcade experience to a point that the hardware can't handle. Now, for what I think is the coolest version, the PC Engine CD version, this port was handled by Naxitsoft, a rather prolific developer who also worked on a number of PC Engine titles and a few Game Boy and NES games also. This one didn't come out until 1993, which was after Super Double Dragon had been released on the SNES. It was arguably the last good Double Dragon to be released for another 20 years. But we'll talk more about that later. This is a really cool port. Instead of a port of the arcade game, this one is an upgrade to the NES title. So you'll notice right away the huge improvement to the graphics, though the sprite designs kind of feel like they're missing something, they don't quite fit. Some of the animations look kind of weird too, like who punches like this? The game still looks really nice overall though, with a greatly improved color palette and all new level and enemy graphics. The overall style is very different from the NES game, and that may turn some fans away. I know it threw me at first. CD quality audio really seems like it would be such an amazing addition here, but the soundtrack is completely changed and a lot of it doesn't really fit. What's up with PC Engine ports having totally new and totally worse soundtracks? This is not the only one. Why am I finding the Shadow Warriors to like jazz music? What few actual Double Dragon tracks made it over sound excellent, but the rest is basically elevator music. It's really weird. Making full use of the CD-ROM media, animated cutscenes have been added. And yes, these look very crude by today's standards, like Newgrounds 1999 crude, but they were truly groundbreaking at the time. I mean, sure, Billy and Jimmy look like they were made in MS Paint, but trust me, in 1993, this was high-tech stuff. The stages have been redesigned just a little, most notably the helicopter, which is now 3 times as long. Some other rooms and areas have been added to lengthen the game. Missions 4 and 5 have been switched as well, and the platforms in the Shadow Fortress have been rearranged. That all feels quite a lot easier this time around. Like most PC Engine games, the controls feel really fast and responsive, and you can finally damage enemies by throwing them at each other. Another thing I noticed about this version is that the Hurricane Kick hits enemies most of the time, whereas in the other versions they almost always duck, which is very frustrating. So here, you can just kind of spam it, which might not be better. It does feel overall much easier than the NES version. The traps are nowhere near as dangerous, they seem a lot easier to navigate through. There is one really glaring flaw in this game though. There's a limit of only 2 enemies on the screen at a time. Shut it down, deal breaker. In a beat 'em up, that's just no good. It doesn't feel very action-packed, and it makes the game kind of drag because of how long it takes you to fight through all the enemies. I didn't really notice it at first, but about halfway through the game, it started to become really obvious when I was expecting the screen to fill up with more enemies, and it never happened. There is a hard limit of 5 credits, and I wish there wasn't. It's really hard to get through this game on 5 credits, even if it is easier than the NES, but it is a really cool port, and while it fails to be as good gameplay-wise as the NES predecessor, it is really cool to see a version of this excellent game with upgraded graphics and sound. I kind of forgot to mention this because I felt like it goes without saying, but I think that I should mention in the NES and PC Engine versions, of course, you have to press A and B together to jump, just like in the NES version, which I think I forgot to mention in that video as well. I kind of assume if you're listening to this that you've probably played it, and you probably know that the controllers have 2 buttons. But I understand I shouldn't take anything for granted, because you never know, somebody might stumble upon this channel who's not familiar with these platforms and not be aware of that, and then be surprised when they play it and say, hey, wait a minute, there's only 2 buttons on this thing. But there you have it, my full breakdown of what I feel are the 4 most notable versions of Double Dragon 2: The Revenge. Which version is your favorite? Is there another version you grew up with that you think I should try out, like Amiga or Spectrum or something like that? Let me know in the comments, and even just, throw a comment down there to let me know you were here. Help me out by liking the video, subscribe to the channel. We need to tell that YouTube algorithm that people want to see these videos, that you want to hear my voice and hear what I have to say about these games. I think I have a unique point of view a lot of times, and I think that my scripts are good. I think my narration is pretty good, and I want to reach a larger audience. And if you have any ideas, let me know. Tell me in the comments if there's any games that you would like to see me review, or any questions that you would like to ask. If there's anything about a game you've always wanted to know, maybe I can make a video about that. Thank you once again for watching, and until next time, game over.